Welcome to On Contact. We came to Cambridge, Massachusetts to meet with Professor Noam Chomsky, arguably America's greatest intellectual. I wanted to ask you about the 10 principles that are laid out in the book. And the first one you talk about is reducing democracy. Your second point, shaping the ideology. Principle number 3, redesign the economy. Let me move on to shifting the burden. On Contact with Chris Hedges. This is the second part of our conversation at his office at MIT, focusing on his latest book, Requiem for the American Dream. On Contact with Chris Hedges. So principle number 5, attack solidarity, and you bring up Social Security. When we're watching this happen as we speak, what is this about?
Solidarity means concern for the fate of others. So I don't have children or grandchildren in elementary school, so why should I pay taxes? Why do I have to care that the kid across the street goes to school? Well, solidarity means you do care. Social Security is based on the concept of solidarity. You care that the widow across town has enough food to eat. The institution that was built on solidarity is the labor movement. Solidarity is its slogan. We're all in it together. We work together to try to achieve common goals. That's the ideal, at least. And a functioning society a healthy society will be built on the idea of
why is it important?
It's important for people to defend themselves, to protect themselves. If you're alone standing against concentrated power, you don't have a chance. If you're working with others, you do have a chance. You have the power of the majority, in fact, to defend your rights, to defend the rights of others. But there's also a simple ethical principle. Do we care about others? It's kind of interesting that if you go back to the icons of neoliberalism, like Adam Smith, he regarded sympathy as the most fundamental human emotion. In fact, it's kind of interesting to look at his notion of invisible hand, which everyone talks about. Take a look at what he actually meant by it. He barely used the term, so it's easy to find out. What he argued, for example, that suppose that it's an agricultural society, suppose that some landlord accumulated most of the land and other people didn't have any. He said it wouldn't matter much because of the natural sympathy of the landowner for the fate of others. He would make sure that there's a relatively egalitarian distribution of resources, so as if by an invisible hand we would be saved from the destruction of concentration of power. That's Adam Smith. Compare it with what's now called libertarianism, which means we take what we want and the heck with everyone else.
Well, without solidarity, your society disintegrates, in essence, doesn't it?
And that's the point. Remember Margaret Thatcher? There's no society,
right,
which was an ideal, not a description. In fact, unwittingly, she was paraphrasing Marx, who condemned the French aristocracy after the repression because they were turning society into a sack of potatoes, an amorphous mass in which individuals could not participate and function. That's the neoliberal ideal, which Thatcher stated quite accurately.
Let's talk about run the regulators. And this has been the capture of regulatory agencies by the very industries that are supposed to be regulated.
It's called regulatory capture. It goes way back. Very commonly, the business world has actually instituted regulation, or supported it, to protect themselves from the highly destructive effects of an unregulated market, which can be extremely destructive, and the business world doesn't want to be destroyed. So they kind of either tacitly supported or sometimes even initiated regulation on the assumption that they would be able to take it over and regulate it in their interests. And to a very large extent, this happens. So you find that the regulators for a particular industry are often very closely linked to the industries that they are regulating.
Well, we're watching that with the EPA, with Pruitt right now.
Well, that's a dramatic case where the EPA is actually being virtually dismantled. But you find it in the SEC, the railroad regulations.
The FCC.
Yeah, it's been it's very
But why
common
is that? But I think you make an interesting point that kind of revolving door where people...
That's one of the techniques, is to, those who who Adam Smith called the masters of mankind, who have the resources and are being regulated, can offer all sorts of inducements, like when you leave, we'll give you a cushy job. Holds for Congress
Robert
as well.
Rubin.
Yeah, that's one of the many devices by which wealth and power can ensure that the kind of regulation that takes place is in their interest. Doesn't work 100%, of course, but it's a very important tendency.
And yet I think you would say that after the 1960s, in the early 1970s, under of all things, the Nixon presidency, we had the consumer safety legislation, the safety and health regulations in the workplace, OSHA, we had the EPA, Clean Water Act, Mine and Safety Act, but these came out of movements.
They
right?
came out of the pressure of popular movements, just like the New Deal. If it hadn't been for CIO organizing, sit-down strikes, labor militancy, political activism, the New Deal policies wouldn't have been enacted. They're never gifts from... There happened to be a reasonably sympathetic administration in the 30s, but as Roosevelt himself pointed out, you better pressure me, otherwise I can't do it. That's part of the significance of solidarity.
You talk about the nanny state. What do you mean? The nanny state, what do you mean by that?
The nanny state is a state that gives gifts to sectors that have the power to demand it, which typically means the rich and the powerful. I mean, there's...
So is this like subsidies to the fossil fuel industry?
Well, there's hundreds of billions of dollars. I think it's something like $500 billion a year to the fossil fuel industry.
We're talking about government subsidies.
Plain government subsidies. Take, say, the financial industries, which the ones that exploded during the neoliberal period. There was an interesting IMF study that came out of International Monetary Fund a couple of years ago, which tried to determine the source of the profits of the 6 largest American banks. Turned out it's almost entirely public subsidy through the indirect effects of the implicit government guarantee. It's called informally too big to fail. It means that there's an implicit guarantee that they're not going to fail, which means you get access to cheap credit, inflated credit ratings, incentive to carry out risky, hence generally profitable transactions. If anything goes wrong, the public will bail you out. That amounts to, the business press estimated that at about $80 billion a year, just straight subsidy. In fact, everywhere you look, there's massive subsidy. And it's more than that. I mean, take, say, the high-tech economy, computers, internet, satellites, microelectronics, the components of your iPhone, whatever it may be. Almost invariably, they trace back to public subsidy in the state sector of the economy, either actual state sector, like places like this, which are fundamentally part of the state sector, or subsidy to IBM or something like that. And in fact, what typically happens, computers are a striking case, for decades, the risky and creative work is basically funded by the public. Finally, it's handed over to private corporations for marketing and profit. And they indeed are protected by monopoly pricing rights.
You had an interesting figure here. You said corporations spend about $2.6 billion a year on lobbying expenditures. That's more than the $2 billion we spend to fund the House at $1.18 billion and the Senate at $860 million. What does that say about our democracy?
Well, actually, the huge increase in lobbying also took place at this transition point between the regulated capitalism and the neoliberal capitalism. Early 70s, you start getting a very sharp increase in the number of lobbyists. In fact, it's probably more lobbyists.
Who are writing the legislation, literally.
They're basically writing the legislation. I mean, a congressperson usually relies on the staff to write the legislation, which maybe he or she tweaks and signs. What does the staff do? They consult with lobbyists, who are often experts in the area where they're writing the legislation. So they produce suggestions, sometimes actual texts of legislation, which then go to the congressperson.
Well, that's how we got Obamacare.
That's
Who wrote it? Liz
very
Fowler.
much so. A lot of it came straight out of the insurance company.
Let me ask about engineering elections. Citizens United, of course, which creates this kind of legal fiction that this is the right to petition the government and free speech. The Democrats spent $1 billion on their election and lost. We just saw the most expensive House race in U.S. history in Georgia, which the Democrats also lost. What is this process? What have they done? Gerrymandering? I think we could argue that the Democratic Party is not, by the definition of a party, even a party. What's happened?
Well, first of all, we should recognize that this goes very far back. Back in 1895, the great campaign manager, Mark Hanna, was asked, what does it take to run a campaign? He said, there's two things. The first thing is money, and the second one I've forgotten. And there's been very good research into this. Thomas Ferguson's done a lot of it, some others, and it turns out that simply campaign spending is a very good predictor of electability. One of Ferguson's really recent studies is a detailed study of congressional elections from about 1980 to the present. And if you just take a look at that one variable, campaign funding, you get almost perfect prediction of who's going to be elected. And that, of course, means what policies are going to be instituted. Citizens United, of course, opened the doors even wider. But the idea that corporate entities have the rights of persons, that goes back really to the early court decisions of the early 20th century.
Right.
And then it's been expanded. And by now, the Buckley v. Valeo, Citizens United have just basically opened the doors. So now it's out of sight. But it's striking that it can be overcome. The most dramatic feature of the last election, 2016, was not the victory of a billionaire with plenty of funding and huge media support. That's a little off the norm, but not much. It was the Sanders campaign.
We'll talk about that when we come back. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky. I want to move on to your eighth principle, keep the rabble in line, which maybe the seminal point of that is the breaking the labor movement.
Breaking the labor movement is critical. The U.S. has a very violent labor history, much more so than comparable societies, all kinds of reasons. But the labor movement is, for example, hundreds of workers were literally being murdered in labor actions at a time when that was unheard of in Europe, Australia, elsewhere. In fact, repeatedly, the labor movement has just been smashed. By the 1920s, a very vibrant
it was crushed.
Labor movement was just essentially wiped out. There's a book by one of the leading labor historians, David Montgomery, called The Fall of the House of Labor. It's about the 20s. It did revive in the 1930s.
So we should say with the breakdown of capitalism.
After the Great Depression, really serious, worse than the 2007-8 crash, which was bad enough, the labor movement did reconstitute itself. And CIO organizing was critical, and pretty soon you had a powerful labor movement with many constructive effects on the society. Things were put on hold during the war. Immediately after the war, the attack on labor began.
Taft-Hartley.
Taft-Hartley in 1947.
McCarthyism.
Massive programs by capital to control schools, sports clubs, almost anything you can think of.
There's two, you point out that with this attack on labor came the ideology, one, demonizing government, and two, you say politicians always talk about jobs, but they never talk about profits.
That's an unpronounceable, obscene word. When a politician says, I want to defend jobs, he means, I want to defend profits. I don't care about jobs. That goes right to the president, to our current official leader. But you're not allowed to pronounce the word profits. That's an obscene word. So it's pronounced jobs. That's one of the devices like free trade and others that are used to mask policies that are in fact directed and oriented towards the masters of mankind and their welfare. And this is all, the attacks on labor are very significant because the labor movement is the one major organization in which much of the public, the general working public, can organize, get together to make decisions, to even have educational programs. And
yeah, you make that point that it's more than just organizing.
Oh, yeah.
It was about consciousness. It was about building community. It was awareness. Yeah. And, of course, now what are we down in the public sectors below 10% in terms of people who belong to unions?
And there's a coming attack on the last bastion.
Teachers.
The public.
That's right.
We're going to have it pretty soon in the Supreme Court when a couple of cases are coming up which could justify what's called right-to-work legislation, which is another Orwellism. A right to work means right to scrounge. It means the right to be recognized and defended by a union, but not to pay for it.
Right.
And of course, that has obvious consequences.
I want to talk about principle number 9, manufacturing consent, which comes out of your great book, A Manufacturing Consent, with Edward Herman, a phrase taken from Walter Lippmann. And that's extremely important because it's been very successful. The public relations industry, working on behalf of corporations and government, has very effectively, if we want to go back to the word, indoctrinated the public. Speak a little bit about that, what they've done to our consciousness.
Well, the public relations industry, which is a huge industry, of course, is developed in the freest societies in the world, in Britain and the United States, out of a recognition that enough freedom had been won that people can't be controlled by violence easily. So therefore you have to control their opinions and attitudes. And this was quite explicit, early 20th century. You have to control, make Lippmann, who's a striking example because he's kind of a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal, regarded as one of the great defenders of democracy. But his view was that the public had really no role in public affairs.
This is public opinion.
They should be spectators, not participants. And the what he called the responsible men, serious guys like us, we should really run things in the interests of the general public, who are stupid and ignorant and don't understand what's good for them. That's an essential feature of liberal democratic theory. See it all over the place, goes way back. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is simply driving people towards what the business press called the fashionable things, the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. If you can direct people to spend their time buying the latest gadget that they don't want.
Well, you
will
call
throw
them uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices.
Yeah, which is an interesting concept, because if you ever took an economics course, you know that markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. And it's somehow overlooked that we have a huge industry, hundreds of billions of dollars a year, trying to undermine markets by creating uninformed consumers who will make irrational choices. Now, that's what every advertisement
And you carry
is.
this through to elections. You say what they also create is an uninformed electorate that will make irrational choices against their own interests.
Well, let's take the last election as an example. A particularly striking feature of it was that issues were ignored in favor of personalities. So
Hasn't that been true for a long time, though?
it's been true for a very long time, but here it was really dramatic. After all, we are facing two existential crises, new in human history. One, which has been going on for a while, is the threat of nuclear war, which is in fact increasing. The other is the threat of environmental catastrophe. Now, take a look at how much coverage there was of that in the last two elections, just these two things.
Well, even on the media, it's not just coverage, the media doesn't. All they
That's
talk
not
about
even-
is Russia.
Not an issue, yeah. Talk about marginal issues. And in fact, there is a media principle, which you know better than I do, that is called objectivity, which means pay attention to what's happening within the Beltway. If you can report accurately what's happening there, you're objective. Talk about something else, you're biased.
Well, it's gossip. Most of it's gossip.
Bias. And since within the Beltway they're talking about what's important to power, you keep to that.
The last point, marginalize the population. What do you mean by that?
It means make sure that the public is what Marx called a sack of potatoes, an amorphous mass, what Thatcher called eliminate society, just have individuals. When you just have scattered, atomized individuals, not linked to one another, not connected by active, functioning organizations, they're going to be victims.
And you say, you raise this point, you say that what this does is it creates an unfocused anger that supports political figures whose goal is to harm them, the population, as much as possible.
That's exactly what we see dramatically, not just in the United States, but all over the industrial world. There's a tremendous amount of anger, hatred of institutions, collapse of centrist political organizations. Some of it's organized and effective, like, for example, the Sanders campaign or the Corbyn phenomenon in England or Podemos in Spain. It's there. But a lot of it is just basically anger. We're being badly treated, which is correct. Nobody's paying attention to us, which is correct. Nobody's defending our interests, correct. That's a perfect situation for a demagogue to appear and say, I'm the guy who's going to protect you. So just believe what I say. I'm going to bring jobs. I'm going to make the country great. I'm going to do all these wonderful things. Meanwhile, while I'm the focus of television attention, in the background, my associates are busy passing legislation, issuing directives which are undermining and destroying you. We see it very clearly in the current so-called health plan, which has nothing to do with health. It's a program of tax reduction for the very wealthy.
And Obamacare was already a corporate...
Obamacare was a bit of an improvement on what existed, nowhere near what it should have been.
You talk about values. You say that in a society based on control by private wealth, the society reflects those values, which are greed and the desire to maximize personal gain at the expense of the other. Now, a small society based on that principle is ugly, but it can survive. A global society based on that principle is headed for massive destruction, which is us.
Yes, and there's very simple reasons. Take the environmental crisis, which is very real, and it's not centuries away. It's imminent, next couple of decades. If individuals are geared to maximizing their own individual gain, let's get the fastest car that I can, use as much fossil fuels as I can, forget whether my grandchildren will have a place to live, it's not my business, forget the tens of millions of people in Bangladesh who are going to be inundated by sea level rise, not my business, then we're heading to the precipice. And we won't escape. We won't escape, but it'll be not far down the road. So yes, that's inherent in market societies based on, with a public consciousness based on individual gain and greed and lack of concern for others.
Great. Thank you. That was Professor Noam Chomsky. Thank you for watching. For more of our conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky, go to rt.com/oncontact. I'll see you next week.